No one expects their peaceful lake cabin to become a war zone, but mine did thanks to a letter from the HOA. Picture this, a white BMW stuck up to its hubcaps in thick, clinging brown mud, designer heels scattered dramatically across the soggy ground, and a woman in a $1,000 outfit crying hysterically while flailing her arms. Everything started right here, in the heart of a place that had once been my refuge, my sanctuary from the world's noise. But before I dive into the jaw-dropping details, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious how many people have faced outrageous, ridiculous HOA drama like this. My name is Gray Morrison, and I'm a 34-year-old hydraulic engineer who inherited my grandfather's cabin at Silverwood Point. The property sits on the shores of what used to be called Mountain Pine Lake, nestled in the heart of Redwood Shore Estates, Colorado. When I say this place is beautiful, I mean it takes your breath away every single morning. There's this ancient oak tree right in front of the cabin, probably been standing there for over a century, watching generations of my family come and go. My grandfather built this cabin back in 1987 with his own hands. Every permit properly filed, every regulation followed to the letter. I actually wrote my college thesis on the ecosystem of this exact area, so I know every inch of this land like the back of my hand. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was out on the dock replacing some rotted planks and enjoying the September sunshine filtering through the oak's massive canopy. The lake was mirror still, reflecting the mountains in the distance, and I was thinking about how my grandfather used to sit in this exact spot every evening with his coffee. It was one of those moments where everything feels right with the world, you know? Then I heard the crunch of gravel and looked up to see a gleaming white BMW pulling into my driveway. The woman who stepped out looked like she was dressed for the Met Gala at 8 in the morning. Designer everything from head to toe. Sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and this air about her that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." She marched up to me with a manila envelope in her perfectly manicured hands and announced, "You must be Gray Morrison. I'm Crystal Ramsey, president of the Redwood Shore Estates Homeowners Association." Her voice had this practiced sweetness that immediately put me on edge. "I'm afraid I have some unpleasant business to discuss with you today." She handed me the envelope with a flourish that suggested she was doing me some kind of favor. Inside was a single sheet of paper with bold letters across the top. Notice, non-compliant property structure. My heart sank as I read through the accusations. Apparently, my cabin was now considered an unauthorized structure affecting community aesthetics and posed potential safety and environmental concerns. The letter demanded immediate compliance with HOA standards or face legal action. I looked up from the paper to find Crystal studying my reaction with obvious satisfaction. "Mrs. Ramsey," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible, "this cabin has been here for nearly 40 years. My grandfather obtained every necessary permit from the county, and I have all the documentation to prove it." I gestured toward the solid log construction and the well-maintained dock. "There's nothing unauthorized about any of this." Crystal's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. "Mr. Morrison, I understand you may have sentimental attachment to this structure, but the reality is that it simply doesn't meet our community standards. Redwood Shore Estates is a premium neighborhood, and property values are our primary concern. Frankly, this rustic cabin situation is bringing down everyone else's investments." The word situation hit me like a slap in the face. This wasn't just some structure tour, this was 4 decades of my family's history. My grandfather's legacy, the place where I'd learned to fish and swim and appreciate the natural world. I walked over to my truck and pulled out a weatherproof folder containing copies of every permit, survey, and legal document related to the property. "Everything here is completely legitimate," I said, handing her the folder. "The county approved this construction, and there's never been a single violation or complaint in all these years." Crystal barely glanced at the documents before handing them back. "I'm sure you believe that, Mr. Morrison, but the HOA has its own standards now. We've invested heavily in making this community something special, and we simply cannot allow outdated structures to compromise that vision." That's when I realized this wasn't really about regulations or community standards. This was about power and control, about someone who decided my family's history didn't fit into her perfect picture of what the neighborhood should look like. Crystal adjusted her designer sunglasses and delivered what she clearly thought was the killing blow. "I strongly suggest you consider your options carefully, Mr. Morrison. We have legal resources at our disposal, and we're prepared to use them. It would be much easier for everyone if you simply chose to comply voluntarily." The threat was unmistakable, delivered with that same saccharine smile. As she walked back to her BMW, her heels clicking against the stone pathway, she called over her shoulder, We'll be in touch very soon about your decision." I stood there under my grandfather's oak tree, watching her drive away in a cloud of dust and indignation. For 34 years, I'd never met anyone who could make me feel angry and protective and determined all at the same time. But Crystal Ramsey had managed it in less than 10 minutes. As I looked down at the violation notice still in my hands, then up at the cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of Morrisons, I made a decision. If Crystal Ramsey wanted a fight, she was going to get one. What she didn't know was that she'd just picked a fight with someone who understood this land better than she'd ever understand anything in her perfectly manicured life. 1 week after Crystal's dramatic visit, I discovered just how serious she was about her threats. I was heading to the cabin after work on a Friday evening, looking forward to a peaceful weekend by the lake, when I found my usual access road blocked by a brand new chain-link fence and a massive sign reading, "Park Lane, property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." My heart sank as I realized what had happened. Crystal had somehow managed to buy the small lot between my cabin and the main road, effectively cutting off my direct access to my own property. I parked my truck at the roadside and walked over to examine the fence more closely. It was professional grade, obviously expensive, and completely legal if she owned the land. That's when I heard a familiar voice calling my name. Harold Peterson, my 70-year-old neighbor who'd been friends with my grandfather for decades, was walking over from his property with a grim expression on his weathered face. "Ray, son, I'm afraid I've got some bad news about what happened here," he said, gesturing toward the fence. "That Ramsey woman bought this lot 3 days ago through some kind of shell company. Paid cash, way over asking price, just to make sure she got it before anyone else could even make an offer." Harold's revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always known about this small parcel of land that used to belong to my grandfather years ago, but he'd been forced to sell it during some financial difficulties in the 1990s. The lot had changed hands a few times since then, but it had always remained undeveloped and accessible. "She specifically asked the realtor about blocking access to your cabin," Harold continued, his voice heavy with disgust. "Made it clear that was her primary objective in buying the place. I've lived in this community for 43 years, Gray, and I've never seen anything so deliberately vindictive." The implications were staggering. To reach my cabin now, I'd have to drive an extra 45 minutes through winding mountain roads instead of the simple 5-minute trip I'd been making my entire life. Crystal had turned my peaceful weekend retreat into an endurance test, and she'd done it all completely within the bounds of the law. As Harold and I stood there looking at the fence, I felt a mix of admiration for her strategic thinking and fury at her willingness to destroy something meaningful just to prove a point. "There's more, son," Harold said quietly. "She's hired a security company to patrol the area. They've got cameras set up and everything. She's creating what she calls a buffer zone between your cabin and the rest of the community." That weekend, I made the long drive around the mountain roads to reach my cabin, and the journey gave me plenty of time to think. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted and frustrated, exactly what Crystal had intended. But as I sat on my deck that evening, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I remembered something my grandfather used to say. "Patience, Gray. The land remembers everything, and it always has the last word." I spent the next few hours walking the property boundaries, really looking at the drainage patterns and water flow for the first time in years. My engineering background kicked in as I noticed how the natural depression where Crystal's new lot sat would collect runoff from the surrounding hills. Monday morning brought an email from Crystal's husband, Dean Caldwell, who apparently served as the HOA's legal counsel. The message was politely worded but unmistakably threatening. "Dear Mr. Morrison, we hope this unfortunate situation won't escalate further. The HOA is prepared to pursue all available legal remedies to ensure compliance with community standards. We strongly encourage you to reconsider your position before this matter requires more formal intervention." The email included an attachment detailing county regulations about property access and environmental impact, clearly intended to intimidate me with legal complexity. Over the next few days, Crystal's security guards made their presence known every time I drove past the blocked access road. They were professional, but obviously instructed to document my every movement. I started taking photographs of my own, noting the times and dates of their surveillance activities. What I found most interesting, though, was how quickly Crystal's buffer zone was taking shape. She'd hired contractors to install concrete barriers and landscaping features that created an impressive visual barrier, but also seemed to be affecting the natural water flow in ways that made my engineer instincts nervous. The breaking point came when I received a call from one of Harold's elderly neighbors, Mrs. Patterson, asking if I could help with a drainage problem in her backyard. She'd been dealing with standing water after every rainstorm, and her usual handyman was stumped. It was exactly the kind of problem I'd solved dozens of times in my professional career, so I spent a Saturday afternoon installing a simple French drain system that redirected the water flow toward the natural depression area. Mrs. Patterson was so grateful she insisted on baking me cookies, and word spread quickly through the neighborhood about my willingness to help with practical problems. But that evening, as I sat under the oak tree feeling pretty good about helping a neighbor, I couldn't shake the feeling that Crystal was winning this war of attrition. The long drive to reach my cabin was wearing me down, and the constant surveillance was making me feel like a criminal in my own community. For the first time since this whole mess started, I began to wonder if maybe I should just cut my losses and sell the cabin. Maybe Crystal was right about property values and community standards. Maybe holding on to the past wasn't worth all this conflict and stress. That's when I remembered my old college thesis research tucked away in a filing cabinet inside the cabin. I'd spent months studying the hydrology and geology of this exact area, mapping water tables and seasonal flooding patterns with the kind of obsessive detail that only an engineering student could muster. As I pulled out those yellowed pages covered with my younger self's meticulous notes and diagrams, something clicked into place. Crystal might have money and legal resources and strategic planning, but she didn't have what I had: intimate knowledge of how this land actually worked. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. The game was far from over. That night, surrounded by decades-old research papers and survey maps, I made a discovery that changed everything. My college thesis hadn't just been an academic exercise, it had been a detailed analysis of what geologists call a seasonal wetland depression. The lot that Crystal had purchased so strategically wasn't just low-lying land, it was actually part of a natural drainage system that collected runoff from the entire surrounding area during spring snowmelt and heavy rains. My grandfather had known this when he'd originally owned the property, which explained why he'd eventually sold it despite its strategic value for access control. I spread out the original county survey maps from 1985 and cross-referenced them with my thesis data. Crystal's lot sat in what environmental engineers call a natural retention basin, essentially a bowl-shaped depression that nature had designed to collect and slowly release excess water. The implications were staggering and potentially devastating for Crystal's concrete barriers and artificial landscaping that disrupted this natural flow. The next morning, I drove to Harold's house to share my findings with someone who'd witnessed the area's seasonal changes for over 4 decades. Harold studied my maps and research with the kind of careful attention that only comes from lived experience. "Your grandfather tried to warn the county about this back in the day," he said, tapping the survey map with a gnarled finger. "Every spring, that low area would turn into a temporary pond for weeks at a time. Beautiful to look at, but not exactly suitable for permanent construction. That's why it stayed empty for so long after your grandfather sold it." Armed with this historical perspective and scientific evidence, I began what I came to think of as my documentation phase. I installed several small, weather-resistant cameras around the perimeter of my property, all completely legal since they only monitored my own land and the adjacent public areas. These weren't security cameras in the traditional sense. They were environmental monitoring devices designed to record water levels, drainage patterns, and seasonal changes. If Crystal wanted to play games with property rights and legal technicalities, I'd make sure I had comprehensive evidence of exactly what was happening to the natural environment. Within days of installing my monitoring system, I captured something that made my engineering background very nervous. Crystal's contractors were dumping construction waste and excess concrete directly into the natural drainage channels that fed into her lot. Even worse, her elaborate landscaping project involved redirecting natural water flow with concrete barriers and decorative retaining walls that essentially turned her property into a collection bowl. She was unknowingly creating perfect conditions for seasonal flooding. But the real breakthrough came when my cameras caught Crystal herself in a moment of perfect hypocrisy. She'd been posting regularly on social media about her commitment to keeping our community clean and environmentally responsible, even organizing online campaigns about neighborhood beautification. Yet there she was on my footage, casually tossing fast food containers and plastic water bottles into the decorative bushes around her property line. The contrast between her public environmental advocacy and her private behavior was so stark it would have been comical if it hadn't been so infuriating. That same week, Crystal escalated her campaign against my cabin by filing a complaint with the county about illegal camping activities on my property. I received an official notice that an inspector would be conducting a site visit to investigate reports of unpermitted recreational vehicle use and potential septic violations. The accusation was completely false, of course, but it forced me to take time off work to meet with county officials and provide documentation proving that my cabin met all current building and sanitation codes. The inspector was thorough but fair, ultimately finding no violations whatsoever and even complimenting the quality of my grandfather's original construction work. Crystal's response to this setback was swift and expensive. Within 48 hours of the county inspector's clean report, she had contractors installing an 8-foot privacy fence around the entire perimeter of her lot, complete with decorative concrete pillars and what appeared to be a sophisticated drainage system. From my engineering perspective, it was obvious that she was trying to control water flow around her property, but the execution looked like it had been designed by someone with more money than hydraulic knowledge. As autumn progressed into early winter, I settled into a routine of patient observation and careful documentation. Every morning before work and every evening when I returned, I'd check my monitoring cameras and update my growing file of evidence. The pattern that emerged was both predictable and deeply satisfying. Crystal's expensive landscaping and drainage modifications were creating exactly the kind of artificial water retention system that would cause serious problems during the next spring thaw. Meanwhile, I began reaching out through proper channels to report my environmental concerns. Using the county's online reporting system, I submitted detailed documentation about potential drainage disruption and construction waste disposal, complete with GPS coordinates and time-stamped photographs. I wasn't making accusations or filing complaints. I was simply providing factual information to the appropriate regulatory authorities about observed conditions that might affect watershed management in our area. Everything I reported was completely accurate and entirely within my rights as a concerned citizen and environmental professional. The beauty of this approach was that it put Crystal in an impossible position. She could continue her aggressive tactics against my cabin, but doing so would only draw more attention to her own questionable construction practices. Every escalation on her part would generate more documentation on mine, and every piece of evidence I collected strengthened the case that her property modifications were creating environmental problems for the entire community. For the first time since this whole conflict began, I felt like I was playing offense instead of defense. As winter settled over Redwood Shore Estates and the first snow began to accumulate in the mountains above us, I spent my evenings reviewing weather forecasts and historical precipitation data. Spring snowmelt typically began in early April, and if the winter snowpack was as heavy as predicted, the seasonal runoff would be significant. The Crystal's concrete bowl would get its first real test in just a few months, and I had a feeling that nature was going to provide a lesson in hydraulic engineering that no amount of money or legal threats could prevent. Winter gave me time to refine my strategy and gather compelling evidence. My environmental monitoring cameras had captured something crucial. Crystal's contractors were operating without proper licensing for drainage work. A quick check with the county permit office confirmed that no environmental impact assessment had been filed for her extensive landscaping project, despite obvious modifications to natural water flow patterns. More damning still, my cameras had recorded multiple instances of construction debris being dumped directly into the seasonal streambed that fed into the lake, a clear violation of state environmental protection laws. The real game changer came in February when I noticed something interesting about Crystal's husband, Dean Caldwell. One evening, I caught a glimpse of Dean through their kitchen window, whispering something to his own reflection, with a haunted look. It was clear that even her own husband was beginning to have serious doubts about her scorched earth approach to neighborhood politics. The man who'd been serving as Crystal's legal muscle was starting to crack under the pressure of her relentless campaign against my family's property. My professional network proved invaluable during this period. Through colleagues at the environmental consulting firm where I worked, I made contact with Rebecca Doyle, a county hydraulic engineer who specialized in watershed management. Rebecca immediately flagged the footage. Any alteration to drainage patterns could spell disaster downstream. Her expertise would prove crucial as I built my case against Crystal's environmental violations. Having a county official on record expressing concern about unauthorized drainage modifications gave my documentation the kind of official weight that would be impossible to dismiss. In March, Crystal made her boldest move yet by calling for a special HOA meeting to address what she termed ongoing non-compliance issues with property maintenance standards. Crystal had choreographed this meeting as her public triumph. She'd been building support among newer residents who didn't know the history of my family's property, emphasizing property values while carefully avoiding any mention of her own aggressive tactics. The meeting notice, sent to every homeowner in Redwood Shore Estates, painted my cabin as a safety hazard requiring immediate community action. The night before the HOA meeting, I spent hours preparing my presentation materials. Unlike Crystal's emotional appeals, I'd be armed with scientific data, legal documentation, and photographic evidence of actual environmental violations. My folder contained county survey maps dating back to the 1980s, professional analysis of seasonal drainage patterns, documentation of proper permits for my cabin, and, most importantly, time-stamped footage of illegal dumping activities on Crystal's property. If she wanted to make this a public battle, I was ready to provide facts instead of accusations. The meeting itself was a masterclass in community theater. Crystal had clearly rehearsed her presentation, complete with blown-up photographs of my cabin, taken from unflattering angles, and a PowerPoint about maintaining neighborhood standards. She spoke passionately about property values and community pride, painting herself as a concerned neighbor, protecting everyone's investments. When she opened the floor for comments, several residents voiced support for her position, echoing concerns about rustic structures and outdated aesthetics in their premium community. When my turn came to respond, I stood up calmly and simply said, "Thank you all for your concerns. I'll see you at next month's meeting." The brevity of my response seemed to catch Crystal off guard. She'd obviously been expecting me to defend myself emotionally or engage in a heated argument that would make me look unreasonable. Instead, I collected my materials and left the meeting with a knowing smile that I'm sure irritated her immensely. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all, especially when you're holding all the cards. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a subtle shift in community dynamics. Harold had been quietly spreading the word about Crystal's property acquisition tactics and her systematic campaign to force me out. Mrs. Patterson, whose drainage problem I'd solved the previous fall, began telling other neighbors about my willingness to help with practical problems, while Crystal seemed focused only on criticism and complaints. The contrast between constructive community involvement and destructive power games was becoming apparent to longtime residents who remembered what the neighborhood had been like before Crystal's arrival. Meanwhile, my weather monitoring equipment was recording promising signs for the approaching spring thaw. March brought thawing snow and saturated earth, just the combination I'd been waiting for. Crystal's concrete collection bowl was about to face its first serious test, and my calculations suggested that test would be spectacular. Every day brought us closer to what I'd come to think of as the natural reckoning that would settle this conflict once and for all. Dean Caldwell's behavior became increasingly erratic as the HOA meeting aftermath played out. During one of his neighborhood walks, Dean approached me silently, glanced at my monitors, and muttered, "Gray, I'm not on board with this anymore." It was a small admission, but it suggested that Crystal's support system might not be as solid as she believed. I didn't respond right away, but before he walked off, I calmly said, "Then tell her. If she pushes this vote, I'll be forced to present everything in front of county regulators and the press." The look on his face told me my message had been received loud and clear. As March turned toward April, I spent my evenings under the ancient oak tree, reviewing my documentation and preparing for what I knew would be the final phase of this conflict. Crystal had built herself the perfect trap with her concrete barriers and artificial drainage systems, and nature was about to spring it. Justice would flow downhill, just like everything else. The first week of April brought exactly the kind of weather conditions I'd been monitoring all winter. Warm days that sent snowmelt cascading down from the mountains, followed by heavy spring rains that saturated the ground and overwhelmed natural drainage systems. My environmental monitoring cameras captured the transformation in real time as what had been Crystal's pristine, expensive landscaping gradually became something resembling a small lake. The concrete barriers and decorative retaining walls that had looked so impressive during construction were now functioning exactly as I'd predicted, as the walls of an artificial pond that couldn't drain properly. Crystal's response to the first signs of standing water on her property was typically aggressive and expensive. She hired additional contractors to install what she called enhanced drainage solutions, which mainly consisted of more concrete work and decorative gravel that did nothing to address the fundamental problem of water having nowhere to go. Her social media posts during this period were increasingly frantic, showing her trying to maintain her image as a successful lifestyle influencer while dealing with what she euphemistically called minor seasonal landscaping challenges. What made the situation even more satisfying was that Crystal seemed completely oblivious to the cause of her problems. She'd hired contractors and landscape designers who were apparently more interested in her money than in providing honest assessments of what was happening to her property. Instead of addressing the drainage issues properly, they kept adding more decorative elements that made the problem worse. Every new concrete border and artificial water feature contributed to what hydraulic engineers call the bathtub effect, water flowing in with no efficient way to flow out. The real breakthrough came when my cameras captured Crystal's contractors making a critical mistake. In their rush to complete what appeared to be an expensive patio installation, they'd hired unlicensed workers who dumped excess concrete and construction materials directly into the seasonal stream bed that fed into our shared lake system. This wasn't just poor planning or environmental insensitivity, it was a clear violation of state water quality regulations that carried serious fines and mandatory remediation requirements. I immediately forwarded this footage to Rebecca Doyle at the county engineering office, along with detailed documentation of how the illegal dumping was affecting downstream water quality. Rebecca's response was swift and professional. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll be scheduling an immediate site inspection and will coordinate with the State Environmental Protection Office if violations are confirmed. This type of contamination can have serious consequences for the entire watershed." Meanwhile, Crystal had escalated her surveillance of my activities by hiring a private investigator to document what she was convinced must be sabotage on my part. The irony was perfect. While she was spending thousands of dollars trying to prove I was somehow causing her problems, I was simply maintaining my own property and documenting her environmental violations through completely legal means. Every photograph her investigator took of me checking my monitoring equipment or maintaining my cabin's drainage systems only provided more evidence of my legitimate, responsible property management practices. The weather pattern that developed in mid-April was exactly what I'd been hoping for, a series of warm, sunny days that accelerated snowmelt, followed by heavy thunderstorms that added significant rainfall to the already saturated ground. My monitoring data showed water levels rising steadily in Crystal's artificial retention basin, with no signs of the natural drainage relief that would normally prevent serious flooding. The concrete bowl she'd created was filling up exactly as hydraulic engineering principles predicted it would. By the third week of April, Crystal's property had transformed from an expensive showcase into something resembling a small wetland preserve. The standing water was deep enough to support waterfowl, and I actually spotted a family of ducks that had taken up temporary residence in what used to be her formal garden area. The sight of mallards paddling contentedly through her $1,000 landscaping while she watched helplessly from her kitchen window was so poetic that I had to resist the urge to take photographs for my own entertainment. The situation reached a tipping point when Crystal's newest contractor, apparently the only one willing to work in increasingly muddy conditions, brought in heavy equipment to attempt some kind of drainage solution. What they accomplished instead was creating deep ruts and churned up mud that made the entire lot look like a construction disaster zone. The irony was that their heavy machinery was getting stuck in the same mud they were supposedly there to eliminate, creating a comical scene of contractors trying to extract their own equipment from the swamp they'd helped create. As April drew to a close, I received notice that the final HOA meeting regarding my cabin's compliance status would be held on the first Saturday of May. Crystal had positioned this as the decisive moment when the community would formally demand the removal of my non-compliant structure. What she didn't know was that I'd been in regular communication with Rebecca Doyle, who had confirmed that Crystal's property modifications violated multiple environmental regulations and would require immediate remediation. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Standing under my grandfather's oak tree that evening, looking out over the lake that reflected the spring sunset in shades of gold and amber, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. Crystal had spent months trying to destroy something meaningful and beautiful, using money and legal threats and community politics as weapons against family history and environmental responsibility. But nature, as my grandfather used to say, always has the last word. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, and I was ready to let the facts speak for themselves. The weather forecast for the HOA meeting day called for heavy rain overnight followed by clearing skies, perfect conditions for maximizing the visual impact of Crystal's self-created swamp, while ensuring clear visibility for everyone who would be driving past her property to reach the community center. Sometimes timing really is everything, and in this case, timing was definitely on my side. Crystal Ramsey was about to learn that there are some battles you can't win with money and attitude, especially when you're fighting against the fundamental laws of physics and the accumulated wisdom of decades. The morning of the final HOA meeting dawned gray and drizzly, with exactly the kind of steady spring rain that turns already saturated ground into a muddy nightmare. By 10 o'clock, when residents began arriving at the community center for the 11 o'clock meeting, Crystal's lot had transformed into something that looked like a disaster movie set. The overnight rain had pushed water levels in her concrete bowl to the point where her driveway was completely submerged. Her expensive landscaping was drowning under 2 feet of standing water, and her pristine white BMW was stranded on a small island of higher ground near her front door. What made the scene even more dramatic was that several other residents were discovering their own vehicles stuck in mud while trying to navigate the roads around Crystal's flooded property. The community center sat on slightly higher ground, but the access roads passed directly by the worst of the flooding, creating a traffic nightmare that forced everyone to confront the consequences of Crystal's drainage modification. As I pulled up in my truck, equipped with 4-wheel drive and mud tires because I actually understood the terrain, I could see neighbors standing around their stuck cars, looking confused and frustrated. Harold Peterson was directing traffic and helping coordinate towing services with the calm efficiency of someone who'd lived through decades of spring flooding in the area. 43 years I've been here, he announced to anyone within earshot, and I've never seen water collect like this except in that natural depression where it's supposed to be. His pointed reference to the natural depression was clearly intended for Crystal's benefit, though she was nowhere to be seen at that point. Her BMW remained stranded in her driveway, and there was no sign of movement from her house. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was tense and expectant. Crystal had clearly been planning this meeting as her moment of triumph, complete with a detailed presentation about community standards and property values. But her absence was becoming increasingly conspicuous as the official start time approached. Dean Caldwell was there, looking nervous and checking his phone constantly, obviously trying to coordinate with his missing wife. When someone asked about Crystal's whereabouts, he mumbled something about transportation difficulties that drew knowing looks from several long-time residents. At exactly 11:15, Crystal finally made her dramatic entrance, and the sight was worth every moment of waiting. She'd apparently waded through the flooding around her property because her designer outfit was muddy up to her knees. Her expensive shoes were caked with brown sludge, and her usually perfect hair was plastered to her head with rain and perspiration. The woman who'd spent months criticizing my rustic cabin situation, he now looked like she'd been wrestling with the landscape itself and losing badly. But the real drama began when Rebecca Doyle, from the county engineering office, arrived with what appeared to be official documentation and a very serious expression. She apologized for interrupting the HOA meeting but explained that she had urgent business regarding environmental violations that affected the entire community. I'm here to serve notice regarding unauthorized modifications to natural drainage systems and illegal disposal of construction materials in protected watershed areas, she announced, producing a thick folder of official papers. These violations require immediate remediation and carry significant financial penalties. Crystal's face went through an amazing transformation as Rebecca began reading from the official notice. First confusion, then dawning recognition, then outright panic as the scope of her environmental violations became clear. "There must be some mistake," Crystal stammered, her usual confident demeanor completely shattered. "I hired licensed contractors for all of this work. Everything was done professionally and properly." Rebecca's response was calm but devastating. "Ma'am, our investigation shows that significant portions of the drainage modification work were performed without proper permits, and we have documented evidence of construction waste being dumped directly into protected streambed areas." That's when I decided it was time to contribute my own evidence to the discussion. I stood up and produced copies of the time-stamped footage I'd been collecting for months, showing not only the illegal dumping activities, but also Crystal's own contribution to the environmental problems through her casual littering and waste disposal practices. "I believe this documentation might be relevant to the county's investigation," I said, handing the folder to Rebecca. The contrast between Crystal's public environmental advocacy and her private behavior was laid out in clear, undeniable detail. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Margaret Williams, the former HOA president who'd been quietly observing the meeting from the back of the room, stood up and asked to address the group. "I think it's time everyone knew how Mrs. Ramsey obtained her current position as HOA president," Margaret announced in a clear, carrying voice. "She organized a coordinated campaign to stack the board with new residents who didn't understand our community's history or values. She specifically targeted longtime members like myself for removal because we wouldn't support her aggressive tactics against established property owners." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as Margaret continued her revelations. Mrs. Ramsey's entire agenda has been focused on increasing property values through forced conformity, regardless of legal property rights or community relationships. Her treatment of the Morrison family is just one example of tactics she's used against anyone who doesn't fit her vision of what this neighborhood should become. The double exposure, environmental violations, and HOA corruption, created exactly the kind of comprehensive downfall that Crystal's aggressive behavior had been building toward for months. But the most satisfying moment came when Dean Caldwell finally found his voice. Standing up slowly and looking directly at his wife for the first time during the entire meeting, he spoke the words I'd heard him practicing in their kitchen window. "Crystal, enough." His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of months of accumulated frustration and embarrassment. "This has gone too far. We need to stop this now and start making things right." The look of shock on Crystal's face suggested that this moment of marital rebellion was completely unexpected. As the meeting devolved into chaos, Crystal arguing with Rebecca about environmental regulations, Dean apologizing to various neighbors for his wife's behavior, and Margaret Williams organizing a vote to remove Crystal from the HOA presidency, I sat quietly and watched justice unfold in real time. Everything Crystal had tried to use against me was now working against her. The legal resources, the community politics, the environmental concerns, even her own husband's professional reputation, all of it had turned into evidence of her own wrongdoing and poor judgment. When the dust finally settled, Crystal faced a perfect storm of consequences: significant fines for environmental violations, mandatory and expensive remediation of her property's drainage problems, removal from her HOA position by a unanimous vote, and the social humiliation of having her tactics exposed in front of the entire community. As residents filed out of the meeting, many stopped to shake my hand and apologize for not speaking up sooner about Crystal's behavior. The ancient oak tree outside my cabin had witnessed many storms over the decades, but none quite as satisfying as this one. The aftermath of that catastrophic HOA meeting played out over the following weeks like a perfectly choreographed drama, where justice and natural consequences combined to create the most satisfying ending imaginable. Crystal's property, still flooded and now officially declared an environmental hazard by county authorities, became a daily reminder to everyone in Redwood Shore Estates of what happens when arrogance meets hydraulic engineering. The sight of her expensive BMW, still stranded in her driveway and slowly sinking into the mud, became something of a local landmark that neighbors would drive by just to witness the spectacular results of her misguided campaign. But the real coup de grace came when my environmental monitoring cameras captured the perfect culmination of Crystal's downfall. She'd been planning an elaborate garden party to celebrate what she'd expected to be her victory over my cabin, complete with catered food and professional photography for her social media presence. The invitations had been sent weeks in advance, promising an elegant outdoor celebration of community standards and successful neighborhood leadership. Instead, her guests arrived to find themselves sinking into mud, their designer heels disappearing into the swampy mess that used to be Crystal's showcase landscaping. The footage of Crystal herself, standing in the middle of her flooded property in a cocktail dress and crying hysterically while her guests tried to extract their cars from the mud, was so cinematically perfect that it seemed almost too good to be true. She'd spent months criticizing my rustic situation and demanding adherence to community standards, only to create the biggest eyesore and practical disaster the neighborhood had ever seen. The irony was so complete that even I felt a moment of sympathy for her, but only a moment. Rebecca Doyle's environmental investigation continued to uncover violations that went far beyond what I had originally documented. The illegal dumping of construction materials had contaminated soil samples downstream from Crystal's property, requiring not just removal of the concrete barriers and artificial drainage systems, but also expensive soil remediation and restoration of native vegetation. The total cost would be somewhere between $75,000 and $100,000, far more than Crystal had spent on her original landscaping project. Dean Caldwell's transformation from enabler to voice of reason accelerated after the disastrous HOA meeting. Within 2 weeks, he'd filed for legal separation and moved out of their house, citing irreconcilable differences regarding community relationships and environmental responsibility. The man who'd been practicing courage in front of his bathroom mirror had finally found his backbone. The community response to Crystal's exposure and downfall was swift and decisive. Margaret Williams was reinstated as HOA president by unanimous vote, and one of her first official acts was to publicly apologize to my family for the harassment we'd endured. The new board immediately voted to recognize my cabin as a historically significant structure that contributed to the neighborhood's character rather than detracting from it. Several neighbors asked if I'd be willing to help with their own drainage and landscaping problems, recognizing that my engineering expertise made me a valuable resource rather than a problem to be eliminated. As spring turned toward summer, Crystal's former property became an unintended nature preserve. The standing water attracted various wildlife species that hadn't been seen in the area for decades. Ducks, herons, and even a family of beavers took up residence in what local kids started calling Crystal's Pond. The county environmental office eventually designated the area as a constructed wetland that would be maintained as habitat for migrating waterfowl. The legal resolution took several more months, but the outcome was everything I could have hoped for. Crystal was required to pay substantial fines for environmental violations, fund the complete restoration of natural drainage patterns throughout the affected area, and cover legal costs for both the county's investigation and the HOA's legal expenses. The financial burden forced her to sell the house at a significant loss and relocate to another state, effectively removing her from our community permanently. On a warm evening in late June, I stood under my grandfather's oak tree with a small wooden sign I'd carved myself. The sign read simply, "Nature wins again," and I placed it at the edge of what used to be Crystal's property, now a thriving wetland area that filtered runoff and provided habitat for dozens of species. The ancient oak's leaves rustled in the evening breeze as if in approval, and I could almost hear my grandfather's quiet laughter at the perfect justice of it all. Rebecca Doyle's professional visits had evolved into something more personal over the months, and we discovered a shared appreciation for environmental problem-solving and natural systems. The final chapter of this story came in early autumn when I received a brief, formal apology letter from Crystal's new address in Arizona, acknowledging her overly aggressive approach to community standards. The letter felt like a genuine attempt at reconciliation, though it arrived far too late to change the consequences of her actions. As I finished telling this story sitting under the same oak tree where this whole drama began, I'm struck by how perfectly everything worked out. Crystal tried to use money, legal threats, and community politics to destroy something meaningful and beautiful. Instead, she ended up creating the perfect demonstration of why patience, knowledge, and respect for natural systems will always triumph over arrogance and artificial solutions. Sometimes the best revenge really is just letting people dig their own holes, or in this case, build their own swamps. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen or anyone who thinks money and attitude can override basic laws of physics, drop a comment below and share your story. And if you believe in the kind of intelligent, patient justice that lets natural consequences do the work, make sure to subscribe for more stories about what happens when common sense meets uncommon problems.